Welcome everyone to our STAMPS webinar series. It's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Jakob Runge. Jakob Runge heads the Causal Inference group at the German Aerospace Center's Institute of Data Science in Jena. He's also chair of climate informatics and guest professor of computer science at Technical University of Berlin. So Jakob studied physics at Humboldt University of Berlin, and he received his PhD at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. After that, he joined the Grantham Institute at Imperial College. In 2020, he won an ERC starting grant with his interdisciplinary project Causal Earth, and his climate informatics group, which I think has members at both German Aerospace Center and University of Berlin. They combine innovative data science methods from different fields, including graphical models, causal inference, nonlinear dynamics, and deep learning. And they work closely with experts in the climate sciences. So the title of Jakob's talk will be Causal Inference and Discovery with Perspectives in Earth Sciences. So Jakob, please take it from here.
Right, so I hope you can see my screen now. Can you?
Yep.
Right, cool. Yeah, thanks a lot for this invitation. It's great to virtually be back in Pittsburgh, where I've visited many times, and yeah, share a bit of my work. So I was asked to give like more of an overview talk. So it is a mix between an overview talk, and then I thought of all the stats people, and I dive a little bit into some topics that I've worked on in the past years in a little bit more depth on causal inference and causal discovery. But I think and then there will be some applications. So I hope there's something for everyone here. Right, thanks for the introduction. I don't need to say much more about myself, my group. A little picture here as a little advertisement for open positions in Jena. And with that, let me just dive directly into this talk. So as a little bit of a step back, we have seen in the past decades the power of machine learning in science and engineering in, for example, tasks such as object classification and localization from like ordinary pictures like that humans can read and recheck whether that really is a dog or a cat. And such methods are becoming more and more applied also in like physical sciences, such as earth sciences, which I've been working on in the past years. And here there are similar tasks that of pattern classification, and this time it's not so well readable by humans. It's like satellite data or so, in which you want to detect patterns. And the same as for images and image classification goes for video prediction and moving to like moving satellite images or so, which would be then tasks such as short-term forecasting. And people are beginning to apply tools coming from video prediction towards these topics. But my talk will not about machine learning, and I will start with a question, a little bit of a teasing question here, whether actually what ML can do is answer questions about what is in the data. And I'm stealing kind of the quotation here from Pearl, who phrases questions of what is and what if in terms of what you want to learn about the system. And here machine learning would be the tool set to learn about what is in the data by learning statistical associations from very complex data, such as those images or physical satellite data and so on. Now, what are challenges in earth sciences and what are the questions being asked there? So a little picture here of a flooding event that was taking place in Germany. And I know there are much more severe extreme events in other parts of the world, but this is something that's was more nearer to my experience, of course. And for such flooding events, we want to understand what are causal drivers of these events and how they lead to such events as floods. And there's a project here at Exciter in investigating this with a lot of colleagues from the data side. So what causes extremes is one of those questions, and it's about what causes extremes and not so much what is related or associated to extremes. And another topic is that of climate change. You all know we are on either one of these two paths towards either global heating or something more according to the Paris target, if well, we do the right decisions politically. And a problem that we as scientists can address is that of reducing these uncertainties that actually come from the different assumptions you put into the climate models. And if you parameterize the way that, for example, processes such as clouds are resolved in models, you get quite different results. And this uncertainty here regarding whether it's 2 degrees or like 5 degrees in 2100 comes from the climate models making different assumptions and resolving, for example, these processes in different scales. And for such problems, we want to learn better, for example, how aerosols lead to clouds. This is one of the most important mechanisms that leads to uncertainties about our future climate. Other questions are, for example, in ecosystems. We want to learn about how CO2 is exchanged within plants and the soil, what is called ecosystem respiration. And we have more and more data about these processes from like flux towers and whatever you can get from satellites about these. Or a topic that I'm addressing more at my technical university group is that of understanding the teleconnections. So all these abbreviations represent different climate processes in the Earth's atmosphere or the ocean, and they are related with each other, and understanding how they are related is an important task, and these are called teleconnection networks then. So that is also a causal task and a causal inference, causal discovery task, discovering these networks and then quantifying their relationships. So answering such questions, what can we do in science in general? So this is very broad now. So of course, the kind of primary approach to gaining causal knowledge, gaining physical knowledge about the system is experimentation. And I'm mentioning randomized controlled trials as a more of a to-go tool or approach in like the medical sciences, or gene knockout experiments, because that is what you can do in these kind of fields, while it's less of an option in a large system like the Earth, because we do not want to experiment directly with our system. On the other hand, what we have in the climate system is a lot of microphysical knowledge, like we know how fluids move. And this here is one of the first climate models from 1969, actually developed by Suguro Manabe, who won the Nobel Prize in Physics last year for this. And another one is Klaus Hasselmann for, well, coming up with first predictions of the climate sensitivity and global warming. So today, climate models are quite complex beasts, and I've mentioned before that they are can be used to forecast, or you would rather say project what happens to the climate system given a certain trajectory of CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions. And I alluded a little bit to this already. What are the issues with these? They are certainly the gold standard, but there are ethical issues. There might be expensive compliance issues in these randomized controlled trials, or they're just not possible. And with simulation models, we have similar issues of them being expensive, time consuming. Like if you really resolve clouds in the scale they are operating, like on the kilometer scale, then you can simulate almost just a day of physics in a day of computational runtime, which doesn't quite give you the power to project the next 100 years. So we need to make compromises there, and these compromises lead to uncertainties. So the third approach that is the topic of my talk is run causal inference, which is really the task of learning causal relations from observational, or if available, some experimental data. So that's the one slide that introduces this a little bit, and I mention some pioneers of this field here that is maybe a little bit biased towards the graphical models perspective, and I'm not doing justice here to many people who've also contributed to this field. But in one sentence, maybe one could say causal inference is a framework to answer causal questions from observational and or experimental data. And I'm picking up here a certain framing that Pearl developed, which divides different tasks that we want to do, different queries that we have about the underlying system into three levels, a hierarchy of three levels. And at the lowest level, what he calls association and the activity being seen, that relates to this what is question posed in the beginning, and what machine learning also actually would be about: pattern recognition, correlation networks, maybe something like statistical weather forecast, where you would assume that the system is not changing much. And on the second level, you have intervention, and he introduces this conditional probabilities at the lowest level. And at this level, you have these interventional distributions, where I will show in the next slide what actually the difference here between this do and the just conditional is. And there you intervene. So that's this experimentation. And the question to be asked there is, what if I do, as opposed to what is? And the examples would be what causes what in the data, infer underlying mechanisms or future impacts of greenhouse gas emissions, or what if I take aspirin? And on the uppermost layer, we have counterfactuals, and the notation here I will actually not explain in this talk. And this is about understanding in Pearl's language, asking the question of why, what if I had done, given I observe a certain state of the system now. And then you might have as examples, did climate change cause this extreme event? So this is called attribution. Or the aspirin question here would be, what was it aspirin that stopped my headache, given that I don't have any headache anymore? And in the following, I will provide you with one slide to introduce the basics of Pearl's causal graphical models framework. So here we have the assumption of an underlying structural causal model with an associated graph. So, for example, if we take the aerosol cloud example that I mentioned before, we would assume that the underlying system has a certain way in which the variables here are, the value of the variables here are assigned to by nature. So that's why this is this colon here, and it's an assignment function rather than just a mathematical equation where you can solve for either or so. So you would assume that the value of XA of aerosols here is determined by some function of environmental factors. This might be these here, and then some eta A, which is noise terms, which represents unresolved processes. And we would assume that such a structural causal model is then acyclic. We don't have to, but for most of the theory that I know of, it's assumed to be acyclic. And we assume the noise terms to be independent here, these eta A, eta C, and eta E. And then, given such an assumption of such an underlying structural causal model, you would have an entailed distribution P of these axes here that then factors according to this factorization given by which values each variable depends on. And this can be represented in this graph. So all the values that occur on the right-hand side as an argument here would have an arrow towards the respective node. So in this, given this underlying structural causal model and the associated graph, you then can define or what an experiment or an intervention is in this model. And this is just a modified, it's a manipulated structural causal model. So you alter, you change this structural causal model to one where if you intervene in XA, you remove whatever XA was kind of naturally depending on before, this function f of A, by the value that you set it to. So if you intervene in A and set it to a value, then this is the altered structural causal model in this thought experiment. And because you remove the functional dependency, you would in the graph remove any incoming arrows to aerosols here, while the other variables would be unchanged and would just get whatever propagates from this intervention. So that results in then an interventional distribution, which is this P of xc, for example, given do xa set to x prime. And this would in general be not the same as the conditional probability of xc, given we observe a certain value x prime. So causal inference now, in this framework, you could differentiate two types of tasks. One that is the one that actually most of Pearl's work would be about is to utilize qualitative causal knowledge in the form of such a DAG, a directed acyclic graph, that can include observed but also unobserved or latent variables, such as this L here. And you might represent this also with a different graph where you just remove the direct unobserved variables and introduce bidirected edges here. So those are cyclic directed mixed graphs. And again, the example would be this aerosol cloud graph, or some other graph that I found online is, for example, in breast cancer. This is just to say that often there exists a lot of expert knowledge, and causal inference would be about utilizing such expert knowledge, which may come in this qualitative form, but not in a quantitative form. And the other task is if you have less knowledge about your system, so you have just your nodes, and then you want to learn the causal relations, you want to learn the graph, using some more general assumptions than the graph itself. So in the following, I will just give you a little overview over these two tasks. So the first one, causal effects estimation. Here the setup is, given a causal graph and data, observational data, usually you would like to compute the causal effect of an intervention from the observational distribution. So this problem on the left-hand side is a quantity that is defined based on this intervened structural causal model. So this is a quantity that you don't have directly access to, that you cannot just estimate, that you cannot perform this do intervention. And the task of identification of causal effects is going from this left-hand side to a function of the observational distribution on the right-hand side. And as a really trivial little example, consider some data maybe generated from this model where we would intervene in X and then measure the effect on Y. So this might be this interventional data that we in principle don't have access to. And this black line would then be like a linear causal effect in this model, if there's a linear relation. If you now approach this kind of naively and you regress Y on X in the hope to estimate this relation, you wouldn't be able to recover it. You would potentially get some other regression line that is strongly biased. So you don't get the correct causal effect for this graph if you just do this naive regression of Y on X.
Jakob, this so question in the chat, so maybe I'll just ask you now quickly. Pakistan is wondering about the slide before, why there's no arrow from clouds to aerosols. Can't the presence of clouds impact the chemical conversion from sulfur dioxide to sulfates?
Oh my God! So this is just an example. It's always dangerous to put on physical. You may at a certain time scale have just an effect of aerosols on clouds. I know that clouds rain and they wash out aerosols. So please just see it as just a schematic that might have. That might be true under certain circumstances. I should always use X, Y, Z and not physical numbers. Okay, sorry. There's a climate scientist here. Okay. Back to this task here. So what for example, given this graph as qualitative expert knowledge, and the query of estimating the causal effect of X on Y, what causal inference theory would tell us, well, build a regression model of Y not just on X, but also on Z. And this is quite trivial, this example, but in more complex graphs, this is getting less trivial. And if you now perform this multivariate regression, then the coefficient, the regression coefficient in front of X here would give you a correct and unbiased estimate of the true causal relation. Given that this is the true causal graph, that this is actually the process or the qualitative causal relations for the data generating process. And this can be actually really, this shows you that there is an identifiability solution to this problem here. On the left-hand side, you have potentially the expectation of Y of intervening in X, setting it to 1, minus that one of setting it to 0, which would give you the slope in this linear framework, and B, on the right-hand side, just a regression coefficient, which is a function of the observational data. So this is just a maybe most trivial example of showing what identification means. And in my work, I've worked on more complex graphs, for example, where the task of, okay, which Z to choose, for example, in this graph here, there's more than one way of performing such a regression. You can perform it on Z2, Z3, but also on just Z1. So there's many options, and all of these, in theory, give you an unbiased estimate, but they give you different variances. So with this, let me move to that talk here, which goes a little bit more into detail about this topic. So again, I mentioned that for this graph here as a qualitative knowledge with these bidirected edges representing some latent confounders, and you have X causing Y directly and indirectly. So there's a mediator here, and just ignore this S for now. This is just illustrating conditional causal effects. So here, all of these different adjustment sets like Z1, Z2, and 6 different are possible here. They would all, in a regression model, give you an unbiased estimate of the causal effect. And that is this black line here. But all of them have different variances. So that's the empirical variance here, but they would all have different asymptotic variances in the estimator. And that is what I'm addressing here. So the open problem is, well, can we somehow find or define an adjustment set that yields a minimal asymptotic variance? So this optimal Z then would be an element of the Zs that minimize this asymptotic variance here. So I addressed this problem from information theory. Move this here. And the basic quantity here that I utilize is the conditional mutual information for a Shannon entropy, which is defined here in this form. And we have some properties such as conditional mutual information is non-negative and 0 if and only if X and Y are independent given Z. And I use this framework because it's somewhat nice to relate it to these problem setting here. So as a little bit of an intuition, consider 2 different adjustment sets, the blue and the orange one here, with 2 very much different variances associated. And the 2 reasons can be drawn from this little example why the orange one has a smaller estimator variance. The first one is that in this regression, after you regress out Z, you have a smaller variance of Y, of like the target variable in this regression, and you have a larger variance of X, which is the effect, the cause variable in this task. And these 2 actually to a smaller variance of the estimator. So I try to now frame this in a conditional mutual information, in an information theoretic way. This is the intuition to choose an adjustment set that maximally constrains the target variable and minimally constrains the cause variable. And to this end, I define this, what I call adjustment information, J here, which is a difference of two conditional mutual informations. And one of them is this one in this Venn diagram that might be just speak to you if you read a bit about information theory. And the other one is this mutual information between X and this adjustment set. So you want to maximize the information of the adjustment set with Y given X and minimize at the same time the one between X and Z. So this is kind of the task. So the results of the following are valid for estimators that obey that the variance of the adjustment set that the minimum over all adjustment sets, the one that gives you a minimum variance is actually the one from which you get a maximum adjustment information. And this relation is what I can show for ordinary least squares regression. Theoretically and empirically, I can see in the numerical results at the end that it also holds for others. So now this problem, let me skip this task. This is just defining that we seek to have an adjustment set that maximizes the adjustment information and has a larger adjustment information than any other set for all distributions that are consistent with this graph. This is what we define as graphical optimality. And we define it for a graph and x, y, and potentially a conditioning variable s here. So an open question also was, is there always an optimal adjustment set? And the answer is yes for DAGs without hidden variables. So this has been found out by Leonard Henkel, Witte, Rudnitsky, and Smukler for slightly non-parametric case. And they found that just use the parents of y and the mediator variables, excluding forbidden nodes. And forbidden nodes are just descendants of m and y. And in this graph, this would, for example, be Z2. That would be the optimal set that gives you the minimal, the maximum adjustment information and the minimal variance. And in the following, I will derive a little bit of an intuition for the case with hidden variables, based on this information theoretic intuition. So if you just use the parents of the target variable here, which would be ZP in this graph, then that is not enough, because suppose there's a node Z1 here that also is related to Y, and that contains information about Y. It's just a bidirected edge here, but it contains information, and therefore it helps in constraining Y. As long as it's not a forbidden node, you would like to include it in your adjustment set. And secondly, what if there's a longer chain of such collider nodes, for example, Z2 here, that given Z1 also has a relation with Y, and therefore you would also include that node. And actually, you would end that chain of colliders only if you reach a tail, or you reach a tail on the outgoing side, or you reach this, there's no other node, so you would include Z9 here. Now, you would not include nodes that have a relation to X, given the ancestors here of X, Y, S. This is avoiding non-causal paths. If you were including this node, then you would create a non-causal path from here, going here, 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 and down there, and you want to avoid that. Except if this one is part of the ancestors, and for example, you would include this node that doesn't create a non-causal paths because that one is blocking this non-causal paths here. So the overall general construction rule is include the parents, include the collider path nodes, which fulfill these conditions here that I illustrated just before, and also their parents. And with this construction rule, I can show that this always yields a valid adjustment set. So if this construction, the set constructed in this way is valid, which means it doesn't create a non-causal backdoor path, then only then a valid adjustment set exists at all. So for example, if we have a graph with this node here, then there is no adjustment set. So you cannot estimate the causal effect for this node, for this graph. And in another theorem, I show that this O set, this optimal set, always has a larger adjustment information than, for example, the set of ancestors, which is another option that was proposed in the literature. And finally, the most important result, which is a little bit more complicated, is just a necessary and sufficient condition for graphical optimality. So you give an ADMG, and this theorem tells you whether or not there exists one adjustment set that is has minimal variance for any distribution. So this is what is a little bit more complicated here. And the kind of corner cases of graphs where this does not work, the canonical cases are twofold. One is shown here when you have a graph where you have such what I call an N node that has a relation to X. You can always come up with a different adjustment set and a different distribution that has a smaller variance. And another example is that of an E node here that covers the second part of this theorem. Also in this case, you can construct a distribution for which other adjustment sets have smaller variance asymptotically. So that's a necessary and sufficient condition, so you can tell directly from a graph, a graphical criterion. Some numerical examples are more in the paper. So I mentioned at the beginning that I could derive theoretically that this optimal adjustment set theory is directly related to the variance of least squares estimators. That's why I can show in numerical results also that the root mean squared error of the O set is always better, for example, than an alternative set here. While for graphs where this does not hold, this might not be the case for other adjustment sets, but always for this adjust set. And for multi-layer perceptrons, we get somewhat more mixed results in the general quantitative setting here, or for KNN. But we saw that in general, the O set is not a bad choice. So in 24%, in the optimal, 28% of the non-optimal cases, it gives you the lowest variance, while that does not hold for other adjustment sets. So even though this does not always work, as in the linear case, it still has better properties numerically, we find, at least for other estimators. And yeah, more theories is to be still developed, but that's it for now for this work here. Going back to the main talk. So that was the topic of given a qualitative causal graph, how can we, in this case, optimally estimate causal effects? The second task was about, well, we don't know the causal graph, so we just have data and want to utilize some general assumptions and have the goal of estimating the graph from the observational distribution. And here I will go about the constraint-based causal discovery framework, which was put forward by Spiris and Gleamer and Shines at CMU some 20 or 30 years ago. And the general assumptions that are being used by this framework are the Markov condition and the faithfulness condition. And they basically relate statistical dependencies to causal relations. So separation in the graph implies independence in the distribution, that's the Markov condition. And the other direction, independence in the distribution, implies separation in the graph is the faithfulness condition. And you need those two to relate conditional independences to the underlying graph. And they are, of course, they can be contented. Like it's a nice way that you have assumptions that you can then argue about and relate them to causal graphs, and you can certainly argue a lot about them, but at least there is a set of assumptions that gives theoretical results. So just briefly, how would, for example, this constraint-based causal discovery work? So you would start, for example, with a fully connected graph and then perform iterative causal discovery, which, for example, utilizes conditional independencies. For example, if you, in this graph, or for this data, you measure that V and W are independent, and V and W are both independent of Y given X. So these two are independent of X of Y given this mode in the middle here. Now, using faithfulness, you would remove all those nodes that pertain to independencies, and then enter a second phase of this algorithm that is about utilizing orientation rules. And one of them tries to make sense of which orientations of causal links here are consistent with these observed conditional independencies and acyclicity. So, for example, can this be a causal relation for the lower part? Can X be a confounder of V and W? Well, if that was the case, then V and W wouldn't be independent, assuming these assumptions, of course. So we can rule that out. In the same way, we can rule out that causal graph and are left with this one, for which it holds true that V and W are independent. So this one is consistent. And then, on the other hand, that arrow here has to go from X to Y, because if it would go in the other direction, we would not measure that, for example, Y and W are dependent and are only independent given X. So only this causal graph is consistent with these observations, and we assumed for this graph that there are no latent confounders. But what if we try to also reason about them? So if you allow the presence of latent confounders, you could maybe think that this link here is actually a confounded relationship. But if you hypothesize this graph, also this would not be consistent with these observed conditional independencies, which you kind of assume as being perfectly known. And this is a statistical, not possible, but let's assume that is known for now. And this graph, for example, is not consistent with the data, because here Y and V would not be dependent. There would be no causal path between the two. And so you can only conclude that this causal link goes from X to Y. On the other hand, here we cannot argue that there cannot be a latent confounder. That is an option. And so the way that is represented then in this partially ancestral graph, to be more precise, is this way. So you learn causally that X is not a common cause of V and W. V might be causally drive X, or there's a confounder. That's why there is this circle here. Why we know that X causes Y. So that's the causal knowledge you gain from these conditional independencies and these assumptions. Conditional independence framework in the more recent past has been augmented by further sets of assumptions. So, for example, the work of restricted structural causal modeling makes use of assumptions about functional dependencies. For example, if you just have two variables, there are no conditional independencies if these two are dependent. But what if you know that, for example, in the linear method, that X and Y are non-Gaussian, have non-Gaussian noise, and their relationship is linear? Then you can perform a certain sequence of tests in the linear method to identify that here Y would, for example, cause X. There's a certain asymmetry that you can utilize. There's an identifiability result that can be utilized here. And more about this in this book by Peters, Schulkopf, and Janzing. And I'm not going to talk about score-based network learning methods, which also try to learn these causal graphs. So my work has been more on the time series case. And this one deals with a certain set of more issues, like you have time-dependent data, so the data is not IID on the other hand, and you have to make more assumptions, such as your causal relations are represented in this stationary time series graph. So it's actually an infinite graph, and this becomes theoretically interesting, and you can make further assumptions, like you only have a causal effect of the past on the future, or contemporaneous effects. And in these few works, we have worked out a version of the PC algorithm for such types of data that addresses issues of the normal PC, the usual PC algorithm, which works quite badly in terms of non-IID data. And that was addressed by some work we did. And we also extended it recently to the case of latent confounding. So the case of not assuming causal sufficiency. So in the end, you learn such graphs where you have directed and bidirected errors. Yeah, I think I'm not going into more details about this, even though, well, maybe briefly. It's so the basic idea here is kind of similar to the idea I've shown you before, namely choosing optimal conditioning sets, but this time in how you do the condition independence testing in the PC algorithm. And maybe I leave it as that, but you can optimize this choice of conditioning sets in order to achieve a higher effect size, a higher detection power, and that then helps to avoid problems of the usual PC algorithm in this case. And yeah, I have to leave it at that because we're already at 40 minutes. But the main results of this paper are that I can, well, show asymptotic consistency. This is not such a major result. I showed in the paper that the effect size is always greater than that of the PC algorithm, or with a conjecture there, and that is really due to the choice of conditioning sets, which is similar to the one on the optimal adjustment, in that you try to condition on the parents of the target variable. And you don't know the parents a priori, so that's the challenge here, but it can be done in a way iteratively that helps in getting better results empirically. So we find that with this approach, so those are false positives for higher autocorrelation, and the PC algorithm at some point does not control false positives anymore, and this method does a better job at that. So you get no inflation due to autocorrelation, and you keep high detection power also for high autocorrelation as compared to other methods that we compare in this paper. So it's empirically statistically better, and we have some theory on why this is the case in the paper. Okay, with this I come to some conclusions in a few slides, but first some view of causal inference and machine learning. I think these are very nice complementary approaches because causal inference brings in the expert knowledge in the form of graphs, and that might lead to, well, you have to estimate, for example, for this causal graph, you would have to estimate this functional here of the observational distributions, and such things can be well estimated, for example, by deep learning. So, for example, the expected value of y here would be the integral over the way in which y depends on x and z, and that can be some complex function. And then you have to integrate out here about the confounding values z here. And that's something that you can implement with deep learning. For causal discovery, causal graph learning, we have machine learning entering the game in the way of conditional independence testing with like Gaussian processes, distance correlation. That's what I've developed a little bit here using these. Or more recent work just tries to frame the whole graph learning problem as a continuous optimization problem. That's interesting new work. Or general dimension reduction to reconstruct variables. Okay. So a little bit of a conclusion towards challenges that we have, and we have a paper here on this with a lot of people from causal inference and climate sciences that somewhat gives an overview of the challenges of causal discovery in Earth system sciences, but I think it's more general. So we try to extract the methodological challenges which are shown here, and hope that more people from the method side work on these topics in order to help better understand these. Jakob et al. Framed this more generally than as causal representation learning, which goes towards complex data and how can we learn representations from the data, how can we reconstruct variables and their causal relations. And all of this requires close collaboration with method developers and domain science, which this forum here is a nice platform for. So briefly, last few slides on some applications. So that illustrates this task of reconstructing the variables in the first place. So this is a little chain of this approach that you are often faced with in climate science. You have data on a spatial grid, like from satellite data, but your hypothesis would be, for example, on how does El Nino, which is a phenomenon, the specific, influence the Indian monsoon. And so the way that you can approach this is you have to reconstruct your variables of interest, for example, by some dimension reduction, which is your choice then. And then you would run causal discovery on these dimensionally reconstructed variables. You get a qualitative causal graph. Then you would perform this task of causal effect quantification in this graph, and then relate that back to a hypothesis about causal mechanisms. So in this paper here, we've done that for sea level pressure satellite data. Dimension reduction gives you 60 different components that describe different processes of the system. And then a causal graph reconstructed from these 60 components can then help you to constrain maybe some hypothesis about causal relations. So here we found that the Pacific causes, and this causes always is under the assumptions that you put into and that you scrutinize and should argue about. But if these assumptions would be fulfilled, and this is the causal graph, then you could read off from this that here the Pacific influences the Indian monsoon system here through the Indonesian archipelago, while it's less so a case for the Chinese mainland here, and with a confounding variable here. So it can help you to learn or to remove or to reason about different hypotheses about a system and rule some out. And I think I don't want to go much into this. This is just to show that maybe you have physical processes, like in the beginning I mentioned, we have climate models and you have observational data, and you want to do something like model evaluation. You want to compare climate models or other physical models to observations, and a current way is to compare how well do the different models represent, for example, some average physical quantities. And another dimension of this comparison could be to estimate causal graphs within each of the model world, and then compare these to the ones estimated from the observational data. So you would then say, okay, does my model well represent the causal relations, causal under these assumptions that you may make of the observational data? And this may help to, also here filter models, and that's what we've done in this work. So take-home message more generally would be, I hope to have given you an overview of causal inference as a framework to answer causal questions from empirical data. And you can dive much more into this, for example, by a number of books that came out. I discussed two settings. One was to utilize qualitative causal knowledge in the form of graphs and then quantify causal effects. And the second one was to learn causal graphs from some general assumptions. And then you can perform step one here, utilize them to perform causal quantification. And all of this is requiring a reasoning about the assumptions about the system and the data, and to transparently discuss these in any work that uses such methods and potentially justify them by looking into the data, whether it is actually linear or how much linear, and whether you've chosen the right estimator for this task. And causal inference can then well complement AI and machine learning on complex data. It is the way to incorporate expert knowledge in the form of graphs. And there's a lot of software. My tool, TigerMite, mainly addresses the time series setting, which others don't do so well, but they do other things much better. PCR, R package, Tetrad, Causal Fusion. And with that, I thank you, and I'm happy to take some questions.